Over the last few weeks, our focus has not only been on how we avoid being this person to somebody else, how we avoid sucking the life out of somebody else, but how do we respond to those people in our lives? All right, in week one, we talked about people that were overly critical. Right, there's always people that are overly critical, and some of you picked up maybe a little bit that you were that person. Right? Anybody admit I was a little critical? And then Pastor Ryan, you knocked me off my song. You know what I'm talking about? And then we talked about the overly needy, the people that will always take more from us than we have to give. Last week we talked about the overly religious. Today we're going to go in a different direction. We're going to talk about the overly controlling. Anybody know any controllers, control freaks? They have to control every aspect of everything. I'm preaching to myself a little bit this morning. But I think at one point or another, we are all this person. I think at one point or another, we are all overly controlling in somebody else's life, maybe even in our own life, maybe in our spiritual life. I think that more than us being a control freak, we easily point the fingers at the controllers. We recognize them very easily. We get frustrated with them very easily. Right? As kids, we have that mentality against our parents, right? Like, you can't tell me what to do. You know what I'm talking about? We have that mentality of our parents trying to control us, but our parents weren't necessarily trying to control us. Our parents had the best interest in mind for us, usually, right? As parents, we know best, even though it seems like we're controlling a little bit. But not everyone in our lives who appears to be controlling is controlling, right? At the same time, there are still people who are controlling, that hold those characteristics and those traits. What we have to figure out, and what our job is to figure out or differentiate between the two groups. The people who are guiding us or directing us or leading us versus the people that are trying to control us and steer us in the direction that they want and what their motives are. How do we keep ourselves from being a part of the problem? Because those people will always exist. So how do we keep ourselves from being part of the problem? And then how do we deal with the people in our lives that are the problem? Some of those people are just needy. Some of them are insecure. Some of them are trying to fill voids in their own life, and they're using you to do so. Some of those people are just jerks, right? Some controllers are just not fun people. And when we don't give them what they want, the reaction is usually not a positive reaction. They pout and they whine and they complain and they criticize. It's interesting, though, when you begin to look through the research on controlling people, there are these underlying themes that pop up in every single research study or article that you read, things that reoccur. I got some of them for you. Here's your first one. It's in your notes. The characteristics of an overly controlling person. Number one, they have a larger-than-life demeanor. They have a larger-than-life demeanor. This doesn't mean that that if you have this big personality that you are a control freak. It doesn't mean if you're the life of the party that you're the control freak. What it does mean is that we have things in our personality when we are this controlling person. We have things in our personality that we can't necessarily back up. We say things that we can't necessarily back up. We present something and we can't necessarily back it up. We know these people this way, but to other people they're this way. Behind closed doors they're this way, but in front of closed doors they're this way. And we see them in various different aspects. And they can't necessarily back up the things that they say. I had this pastor once, and I went in to interview at this church, and I was looking at this youth ministry position, and I go into this church, and it's always funny when you go to interviews, the spotlight is always on the person being interviewed as putting their best foot forward, right? Like, you don't go into an interview wearing shorts and your cut-off t-shirt. I mean, you can, but you probably won't get the job. But you put your best foot forward, right? And so I go into this position, and of course, you present your very best you, and that's always what we focus on. But, for me, I think of all the employers that I've had, and all of them, first off, they're well aware that I speak English, French, and my native language, Nigerian, right? Like, I put everything out there, that I bareback horse ride for hobby, right? Like, that's just me, right? So you put your best foot forward. Sometimes it's lies, sometimes it's truth. But the focus is always on the interviewed and not the interviewer, right? So I go into this pastor, and he rolls out the red carpet for me, right? We go across the country, we fly to this place, and we're being interviewed, and I sit down. He rolls out the red carpet, right? Everything is, he is putting his best foot forward, and he's telling me all these things that I'll have, and the way the ministry is set up, and what's going to happen in our youth program, and sky is the limit, right? You can do anything you want with this, and everybody's so excited, and everybody's ready to support you, and we're changing the culture of the youth ministry at the church, and you're going to be at the helm of it. And so I'm like, yeah, let's do it, right? So I take this job and move across the country, and in my first week, I set up this youth leaders meeting with all of our adult leaders, and we sit in this room, and I'm like, I'm glad you're all, excited I'm here, and here's the plan. This is what we're going to do. They were not aware of the plan, and they were not pleased with the plan. And so the tension started to rise in this meeting to the point where this one lady, who was maybe a little more vocal than she should be, or the others, said, I told him probably 100 times not to hire you. And I thought, man, well, maybe the truth was stretched just a touch, right? When we have this bigger-than-life demeanor, we stretch the truth, and we don't necessarily back up the things that we say. We can't necessarily back up the things we say. That's the controlling person. Here's the second thing. The control freak gets frustrated with normal, everyday questions. They get frustrated. Anybody that gets frustrated or upset or defensive about regular, everyday things? Like you walk up to somebody, you're like, hey, do you know what the copier paper is? And immediately it sets them off. They're like, why would I know the copier paper? I don't even like paper. You know what I'm talking about? Those people that, I don't make copies. Why would I know? And there's this defense mechanism that they put up. And you're just like, no, I'm just trying to print something. And they get frustrated at normal, everyday things. They freak out over normal, everyday things as they seem like an attack on their character. That's one of the characteristics that pops up in studies on the control freak. Here's the third thing. They criticize others to make a point. They criticize others to make a point. Some people have this quality that forces them to attack someone else who maybe isn't in the room or behind their back, and they'll lash out at somebody else. And it's this criticism or this attack to simply make their point. I've heard it countless times in churches where a pastor will stand on stage and he will actually speak negatively of other churches. And he may not even care about the other church, but the whole entire thing is to make the point that our church is the best. And they say things and they criticize things to ensure that you understand the point. It's not just in church, it's in our everyday life, it's in our family life, it's in our work life. Here's the fourth thing. You still with me? You with me? Blank stares all across. I'm assuming I can't actually see your faces. Maybe that's the problem. Here's number 4. They don't take no for an answer. They don't take no for an answer. The control freak will not take no for an answer. And at first glance, that seems like a good thing, right? That's how we get business done. If I come to your car dealership and I want to buy a car and your motto is to not take no for an answer, by all means, get the yes, right? That's how business gets done. But we're not talking about business, we're talking about relationship. We're talking about people. And sometimes this kind of mantra for our life will ruin the relationships that we have. And see, when it comes to this type of person, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how did we get to the point of being controlled? We have people in our life that host these characteristics. How did we get to the place where we're being controlled? First off, because we're human, right? We're flawed. We're insecure sometimes. We struggle with people sometimes. And we're people pleasers, right? Is anybody a people pleaser? We like to please people. Does anybody just like to make people angry? Like that's your thing? No, of course not, right? A couple of you. Trust me, I know. You had to raise your hand. Let's talk later. We like to please people, but the flip side of it is that the controller has a strategy to control you. And maybe you've fallen victim of this strategy, and maybe you're here today and you are the one that uses the strategy. The strategy is twofold. It's threat and it's guilt. Have you ever been threatened or guilted into something? That's a strategy that you use. We've been in situations where, a girl or a guy, like, I'm going to break up with you if you don't. Right? And there's a threat there. Maybe it's your spouse that threatens to leave. Maybe it's your boss that threatens your job based on their insecurities or whatever else. Controlling people threaten people. It's part of their strategy. And then they guilt people. We hear sentences or phrases like, after all I've done for you. You ever heard that one before? Anybody ever used that before? I thought we were friends, right? I thought we were friends, and you won't do this for me? You won't do that for me? You don't call me? You don't love me? Shayna's like, dude, you're preaching your life right now. Threats and guilt. So how do we as followers of Christ love the people that try and control us and try and manipulate us? If you have your Bibles this morning, you can flip them open to the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 16, and of course, it's in your notes. If you didn't bring a Bible, and it's on the screen behind me. In the first book, the first gospel of the New Testament, Matthew writes this story. He's telling the story of Jesus sitting down with his disciples, and Jesus begins to tell his disciples God's will for his life. Jesus is telling his friends God's will for his life. If you're new to church, maybe you're new to the Bible, God's will for Jesus' life is that he would live this life as just a person for 30 years. And then he would spend 3 years in ministry. And at the end of his 3 years, he would be hung on a cross to die for our sins, to redeem us from our sins. That's the plan that God had for Jesus' life. So Jesus is explaining this to them, and one of his disciples, Peter, kind of unintentionally tries to take control of Jesus and distract him from God's will, from the plan that's ahead for him. Jesus is explaining his plan and the situation and what's about to happen. And Peter immediately is like, no. That's not going to happen. I'm not going to let that happen. We pick up Matthew chapter 16 and 20, in verse 21, it says this, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And then he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. I love this. I love that. I love how Matthew writes it. I love the punctuation in it because Peter steps up, he pulls Jesus aside and he says, never. I'm not going to let that happen to you. And it's always interesting in these situations, the controller will always try and pull us aside first. The controller will try and pick us off from the crowd because when we're next to the crowd has influence, right? So the controller picks us aside and pulls us aside and he tries to control in private because there's more of a chance that we cave, right? Think of any gossip situation you've ever been in. Nobody ever gossips in like a big crowd of people. You know what I mean? Like if I'm standing up here and I start talking about how, I saw Susie at the bar. I'm not going to do that, right? I'm going to pull you aside. I'm going to tell you about Susie. I'm just joking. If your name is Susie, I sincerely apologize. I'm not specifically talking about you. So Peter pulls Jesus aside. And it really was never up for debate. The story, the plan of action, what God was going to bring Jesus through was never up to debate. The entire book is about what Jesus is explaining. The entire Bible is about what Jesus is explaining. Peter was trying to control the situation. Whether his motives were good or his motives were bad, he was still trying to pull the strings. He was trying to distract Jesus from what was going to happen. It goes on in verse 23. Jesus turned and said, Peter, get behind me, Satan. I said that a little light, but there's another exclamation mark. Jesus looks at Peter and he says, get behind me, Satan. That's intense. Like there's this intense moment that Jesus had with Peter, and he goes on, he says, you are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Peter is about to build the church. Not a church, the church. Capital C church. This thing that we are a part of. Peter is about to build this. Christ is going to use Peter to build this. Peter's the pioneer for the capital C church. And in this instance, Jesus looks at him and he says, get behind me, Satan, to Peter, the guy that's going to build the church. Peter was his friend, and big plans were ahead for Peter. But Peter, in this moment, is a stumbling block for Jesus. He's the temptation for Jesus. I love you, Peter, but you are attempting to trip me up. Your plan is not God's plan. Your plan is your plan. This is the Son of God who was perfect in every single way, who lived his entire life free of sin, free of error, free of fault. He was free of sin, but not because people didn't try, not because temptation wasn't presented to him. Jesus was constantly tempted. He just didn't partake. So you have Peter that comes along and he says, Jesus, brother, friend, teacher, leader, you don't have to do this. You don't have to do this. This plan that you're about to go through, hanging on a cross, being brutally murdered, you don't have to do this. He tempts him with this thing. And if I had to guess, in that moment, Jesus immediately recognizes this temptation. I wish that we were all that good. I wish that when our vices popped up, our stumbling blocks popped up, we immediately recognized them and rebuked them in the name of Jesus Christ, you know? We saw them, we hurdled them, because we recognize them. What if we saw our stumbling blocks and our vices, and immediately, we just instantly said, get behind me. Get behind. You don't have any jurisdiction here, stumbling block. Peter is the guy who offers a recovering alcoholic a drink. Peter is the guy that takes a sex addict to a strip club. That's Peter in this situation. He is the tempter. Goes on to verse 24. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. See, following a life of Christ is subversive to the life that we currently live. Following a life of Christ is subversive to the life that we live. If we want to save our life, we have to lose our life. We don't get to control it. We don't get to control it. So how does Jesus respond to Peter? Let's break this down. Here's the first thing. He confronts Peter, or he confronts the actions of Peter. Jesus confronts the actions of Peter. He confronts him. Does anybody struggle with confrontation? Does anybody just really love it? Like you love pulling people aside and saying, listen, I've been meaning to talk to you. It's like, that's my hobby actually, I love it. We hate confrontation. We hate to be confronted and we hate to confront. I hate it. It is the worst part of my job. When that type of thing pops up, I hate it. Please do not make me confront you. It's a miserable life to lead. However, if we are followers of Christ, it's necessary. Here's what we do, though. See, Jesus confronted Peter in this situation. Here's what we tend to do. We don't necessarily confront. We don't communicate. We send signals. You know what I'm talking about? We send signals, right? Somebody makes us angry. We don't text them back. Right? We give them the silent treatment, right? We ignore them, or we're passive-aggressive. We don't communicate things. What if Peter had tried to control Jesus by using the silent treatment? What if Jesus brings the silent treatment into the game? Peter goes to Jesus and he's like, hey, Jesus, you okay? And Jesus is like, you know what I mean? Hey, Jesus, you okay? I'm fine. You know what I'm talking about? I'm fine. Hey, Jesus, you okay? And Jesus is like, whatever. Right? Or Jesus doesn't text Peter back. J-Dog, you good? And Jesus is like, I don't know what that is. It doesn't mean that next time your wife does something negative to you or does something bad, you just instantly, get behind me, Satan. But what did... I'm serious. I know from experience it does not work. What it does mean is that we take active steps to communicate with our words, not simply our actions. Our actions will normally get us in trouble. Our words hold value, right? Here's the second thing Jesus did. He reminded those close to him what matters. He reminded those close to him what matters. After he talks to Peter, he looks at his disciples and he tells them to walk humbly and lose their life to gain his? How many times do we do that? Or how many times do we actually receive that in our life? The most annoying thing that Shayna does is when I gripe or I complain unjustly, she agrees with the other person. It's very, very irritating to me because I feel like she should be on my side with everything, right? And I'll be like, you should be on my side. And she'll be like, well, you did cut him off. And I'll be like, no, they cut me off from behind. We have an inability to accept people not necessarily siding with us. Peter speaks up and Jesus turns to his disciples. He's like, this guy, right? Like this guy. He's like, guys, you've got to walk humbly. And if you want to gain life, you got to lose yours. You got to set your life down and pick up mine. You know what life would be like if Shayna agreed with every complaint and irritation that I had? My life would be incredibly toxic because she'd be constantly throwing fuel on this negative fire. So what is our mindset? How do we approach it like Christ would approach it? Philippians 3 says this. It says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself. When we start over. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself. Not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. In your relationship with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. And then there's a semicolon, because I think that he's about to set up what Jesus looks like. In your relationship with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Here's how we approach it like Christ. Number one, we check our own heart and our own motives. We figure out what our heart looks like and what our heart is going after and what our motives are. Sometimes you have to check and see if we are not the controlling ones in the situation. Am I the one, because of my situation and my surroundings and the consequences of the choices that I have made, attempting to control the situation and the people around me? In Psalms, David prays to God, and he asks God to check his heart and make sure that there's no wickedness in it. David asks God, David, who is a man after God's own heart, looks at God and says, God, check my spirit and make sure that there's no wickedness there. David was outcast by his brothers, right? He had gone through some terrible things. He became king, but he had these moral failures. He eventually killed someone to save his own life. There's a period in his life where David is on the run because Saul is trying to kill him. And in the midst of his circumstances, he looks at God and he says, God, check my heart and make sure that I'm still good. Regardless of my consequences, regardless of the situations I've been in, the moral failures, the whatever is sitting there, check my heart, make sure that there's not any wickedness in me. How many times after the life that we've led, after the things that we've gone through, after people coming after us and coming down on us, how many times do we stop and say, God, check my heart and make sure that I'm still good? Regardless of that stuff, am I still good? Here's the second thing. We have to see the other person as valuable. See the other person as valuable. The unfortunate side of relationships that we encounter is a lot of times we look at people and people appear not to hold value to us. Sometimes it feels like it's easier to simply cut people free than to deal with their nonsense, right? It's easier to avoid the text. It's easier to just remove them from our life or no longer speak to them. It's easier. Because what are they benefiting to me? They don't add to my life. What we have to understand is that though they don't appear valuable to us, they're valuable to God. And if they're valuable to God, they better be valuable to me, right? The person that does not benefit me holds value to God. And if they hold value to God, then they should hold value to me. Here's the third thing. Are we willing to accept the challenge of walking in humility? Remember, Jesus said, walk humbly. Am I treating them better than they should be treated? Do I treat them better than they should be treated? There will be a time in our life, and it probably already has been, where it would feel really, really good to give them what they deserve, right? Just to give them what they deserve. They don't deserve to be treated well. They've pushed me around far too many times. And yet still, Jesus says, walk humbly. When we're hurt, it's hard for us to walk that way, and yet Jesus still asked us to do it. And finally, number 4, and I'll close with this. Are we willing to pay the price to do what's right? Are we willing to pay the price to do what's right? In Genesis chapter 26, we find this man named Isaac, and Isaac is brought up a lot early on in the Old Testament. There's a famine in the land, and things are in pretty rough shape. And at the time, a fresh water source was a gold mine. It's how you built your wealth. So Isaac opened up his dad's well, and it flourished. And he became very, very rich. And as a result of him being so successful and rich, because remember, water doesn't just provide something to drink, it watered their crops. It gave water to their livestock and their cattle and whatever else. It's a gold mine. So Isaac starts becoming rich, and he became so rich that the king gets jealous of him, and he orders his men to stop up Isaac's well. So it says they filled his well with dirt, closed it off. So Isaac moves on. He opens a well. He becomes rich and successful, closes off his well. So he does it again, and he builds a well, and he becomes successful, and he's rich, and the king comes and orders men to fill the well. And then all of a sudden the king has this realization that maybe God is on Isaac's side. So he sends his men, and his men go to Isaac. It says this in chapter 26, Isaac then made a feast for them. The men that were filling his well, attempting to ruin his life, attempting to stop his success and his riches, Isaac then made a feast for them. And they ate and drank. Early the next morning, the men swore an oath to each other. Then Isaac sent them on their way, and they went away peacefully. These men come and they attempt to destroy Isaac's life, and he throws a party for him. He makes a feast for him. It's a celebration for these people that were attempting to ruin him. Here's the thing, Isaac sent him away, but he didn't just send him away, he sent him away peacefully. Listen, let me feed you. Let's have a good night, and then you can go tomorrow, and we'll call it even. No one's saying that you have to be best friends, but we have to recognize that some people are not where they should be. Some people are at spots in their life that they shouldn't be there, and our job is not to cut them free or just simply recognize their control. Our job is to bring them up. Our job is to feed them and send them away peacefully. Our job is to walk in humility and always ensure to keep the peace. Why? So people around us see that we walk like Jesus. So that our kids see that we walk like Jesus. So that our spouse sees that we walk like Jesus. Here's the bottom line. We should have such a desire in our life to live a life that looks solely like Jesus. He set up this example, and man, that's the example that we have to live by. We should have such a desire that all we want is for our life to look like Jesus. Because he did it first, and he did it flawlessly. I want my life to look like the flawless one. The flawless one that gave his life for me to redeem me, to save me, to fix me, to heal me. I want it to look so much like Jesus that we're willing to relinquish the control. And we allow God to handle things. Come on, we control our own life. Most of the time, we are the one pulling the lever. And the minute we say, okay, I want to look like Christ, we give complete control to him. Amen? Come on, let's pray. Jesus, thank you.